Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to start by thanking you all for remaining, for making the most of the conference schedule, and for being here for our closing plenary. Just by way of information, we will have a closing plenary with Dr. Hrabowski. Michael and I will then say a few words of wrapping up. Dr. Hrabowski will have a book signing, so there's still some left, so hang in there and know of my gratitude for your presence today. I have to tell you, it is truly a privilege to introduce Dr. Freeman Hrabowski, the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Before I do that, though, I need to offer my deep gratitude to Ann Schmidt-Crump and Paul Crump, alumni of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, for making Dr. Hrabowski's presentation at this conference possible. Ann and Paul, if you don't mind, maybe just standing a little bit, just a little bit. I am delighted that Ann and Paul have been with us throughout the conference and are here today. Ann is currently a trustee at St. Ben's, and Paul served at St. John's University as a trustee as well. So I have had the great privilege of hearing Dr. Hrabowski speak in several different forums. For me, listening to Freeman Hrabowski is to hear someone who shares an outlook and an experience that serves to illuminate my own. He makes me want to be a better leader for every single student that I have the privilege of serving. He speaks with such deep and abiding pride in his institution, and he talks openly about his care and concern for the students entrusted to him. Dr. Hrabowski makes me proud to be an administrator, proud to be a president, proud to say I love my students, and even prouder to serve my institution and higher education. Dr. Hrabowski will deliver the closing plenary today entitled Higher Education and the Transformation of American Society, a 50-Year Perspective. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. I am delighted to be here, and I have to tell you, I have what I call a kitchen cabinet. I had the opportunity to spend time talking with people. Can I move away from this? Is that okay? From St. Kate's. They told me I could be cool and call it St. Kate's, right? And I asked them the question that I would ask of all of you as you think about who you are as people, as universities, as colleges and universities. I said, who are you? And can you give me that elevator statement about it? I'm in a building on my campus which has about 600 acres, students from about 100 countries. And I'm in an administration building that has 10 floors. And I will often ask faculty or colleagues or students something about their research or course, and they have from floor 1 to floor 10 to tell me whatever is most important. Because if you really know something, you can capture it in language that is clear and to the point. And they said that they are a women's college that prepares people to be ethical leaders, that Catholic faith is at the core there. And what's significant to me is that they talked about the idea of the need for joy in education. Because as they talked about St. Kate's, they'd also given me advice about what to talk about. They talked about questions of intersectionality and how do we talk about different kinds of students, for example, and the notion that it might be nice if you don't talk quite as much at us and give us a chance to ask some questions, right? Which resonated with me. But what is most significant that I did not say to them is that they spoke with great authenticity about the power of education and about their institution. Give my kitchen cabinet a round of applause. So I begin with poetry. My mother was an English teacher. Mother, and I'm not going to tell her full story, but Mary and I were talking about growing up in the Deep South, and my mother, I am from Baltimore, which I call the Upper South, by the way. One day we think like Philadelphia, the next day like Richmond. all right? But I grew up in the Deep South, in Birmingham. And I was in the big city, but my mother grew up in a little country town outside of Montgomery, and she was required in her early years to serve as a child maid. She could either be a maid or work in a hot cotton field, and she decided to be a maid because she wanted to see how wealthy people lived, wealthy white people, of course. And the significance was that she was allowed to read books when she finished her work in the library of the home at a time when there was no library, public library for children of color. And interestingly enough, I'll never forget her saying that wonderful book in our own home, the Bible, but that was the only book. And the woman said, Maggie, take the book home when she would find a book. When you come back, let's talk about it. Write me a paragraph. And it was the best beginning of a liberal arts education she could get. And what she found was this, that her girlfriends would become very angry at her because she would say, I want to stand and keep reading. And they would say, no, this is not school time. Why do you want to read, right? And she would say, well, I just want to keep going. And she began to understand the difference between herself and her girlfriends. And here was the difference. She said the more she read, the better a reader she became. And the more proficient a reader she became, the more she enjoyed the experience. And the more she enjoyed reading, the more reading she did. Her girlfriends had the problem that they didn't read enough to become good at it, and therefore only read when they had to. And she would see them frowning and using their lips when reading, and they would push the book aside and say, it's not interesting. Well, nothing is interesting if it's not with some joy. And so she knew then exactly what she wanted to do for the rest of her life, to become a teacher of English. And her favorite author, Zora Neale Hurston. And so I begin with words from ships, from their eyes were watching God. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his head away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. And mother would say, and women, all right? And Hurston's point and my mother's point, the same. There are two groups of people in our society. People like us, people who've seen dreams fulfilled. People who are doing so well, whether you are a faculty member, administrator, trustee, donor, whatever, that you're wanting to help other people's children and other families. And then there are people who, in the words of Langston Hughes, have seen their dreams deferred. The fundamental purpose of education is to help people to dream about the possibilities and to understand what's possible as a human being and to develop a sense of self in such a way that the reading and the thinking and the dreaming can lead to them setting goals and having amazing vision for themselves and reaching and moving towards that vision. And so I want you to hear one other poet this morning who also gives me goosebumps. Her name, the late Maya Angelou, who looked into the face of our country and said, lift up your eyes upon this day, breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it, this dream, into the palms of your hands. Mold it into the image of your most public self. Sculpt it into the shape of your most private need. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face and say simply, very simply with hope, good morning. Good afternoon to all of you. Give poetry a round of applause, would you please? So several years ago, I was asked by some of the institutions in Boston to give a series of lectures on my own experiences that led me to do the work I do today. And one of my premises today is that we're all products of our childhood experiences, more than we realize. And that, and I say this all over, that the way we think about ourselves as institutions, as people who are advocates for the liberal arts, as the language that we use, the way we interact with each other, the values that we hold will be so important. We become like the things we love most. And so the book is about my childhood experiences after my mother had gone on to college and become this teacher of English, and my parents were living in Birmingham. And they insisted that I go to church every week, and even in the middle of the week. What kid wants to be in church in the middle of the week? And they would placate me with the two things I loved most, math and food. So I was getting fatter and smarter all the time. And we Southerners love those cheeks. You know what I'm talking about if you're from the South. But I was doing my math in the middle of the week, and I was eating M&Ms, the good kind with the peanuts. You know the kind, right? Don't you feel it, the peanuts, right? And the guy at the lectern says, if the children participate in this peaceful protest, all of America will understand that even our babies, our young people, know the difference between right and wrong. And he said, and they'll be able to go to better schools. And I was so tired of being in schools where we had some good teachers, but we didn't have the resources. So we were required to use what we called the hand-me-down books. Literally torn up books where they would put brown paper bags around them so you wouldn't see the name of the school. But we children of color knew we were seen as inferior. It was awful. And my parents were not allowed to buy my books because then I'd be different. And so when he said, we could go to better schools with more resources, I said, who is that guy? And of course, his name was Dr. Martin King. And I went home and I said, I've got to go, I've got to move. And my parents said, absolutely not. And I look at them, I'm 12, and I said, you know, you guys made me go. I didn't want to go. You told me to listen. I kind of listened. And now I want to do what he says, and you say I can't. And I looked at him, I said, you're hypocrites. Now, at that time, you did not tell your parents they were hypocrites. There was only one response to come: go to your room, boy. I knew I was in trouble. The next morning they came in, they had not slept, and they said it wasn't that they didn't trust me. They did not trust the people who would be over me, because if I marched, I was going to jail at 12. At the time, I didn't appreciate the significance. I do now. But I will tell you this. I did go. It was a horrific experience. We were treated like animals. It was awful, packed in, on the floor, not in the bathroom, just awful, for a week. In the middle of the week, Dr. King came and said this to us. I was 12, but I had kids there with me. I'm supervising at 8 and 9, and they're crying, and the parents outside trying to look strong for the kids, children in jail in our country because they wanted a better education. Feel it, okay? He said, what you do this day will have an impact on young people who've not even been born. And it was the profundity, we just knew there was something about that. Well, within a matter of a couple of years, after many other awful things, the bombing of churches, the killing of the 4 little girls, and so many things like that, amazingly, we had the marches in Washington, the March in Washington, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the 1965 Higher Education Act, and that's where I'm going with this. America changed dramatically because of that mid-60s period and the legislation that came about. Before the 60s, things were very different. Let me tell you what I mean. What percent of Americans do you think had completed college, 4-year institutions, by the time they were 25 in 1965? What percent do you think? 10? What percent? 15? 7. It was actually 10%. And everything was broken down into black and white. We did not even go in the census. Everything was blacks and whites. In fact, how many of you remember black and white TV? Oh, you look good. You really do. Because my students would say, you must be really old if you're, because my students, what do you mean? TV's always been in color. No, it was not. But here's my point. So what percent of whites had completed college? What do you think? Well, now, if 10% have completed, we know white folks are a little better off. We know that, right? So what percent? 25. Anybody else? It was actually only 11%. Amazingly. And then for blacks, it was about between 2 and 3%. Okay? Why do I tell you that? Here's what I'm saying. Just 50 plus years ago, 90% of Americans never thought their children of any race would ever go to college. That is hard for so many of us to believe. But there were reasons. Obviously, people could get jobs and they could work in factories and whatever, but that was the world then. And then I have to go back for 2 other events very quickly. In 1944, how many of you have heard of the GI Bill? You weren't around, but you've heard of the GI Bill, right? When FDR proposed the GI Bill, what group adamantly, vehemently opposed the idea of veterans coming into our institutions? Ivy League, but not just Ivy League, but who in the Ivy League and in other very prestigious institutions? Take a guess. Presidents, the leaders. I tell presidents this all the time. President of Harvard, president of Chicago. They said, if you allow these veterans into our institutions will become academic hobo jungles. Now, that's 1944. Now, my students say, well, they must have been really bad people. No, they were not bad people. In fact, they were, in many ways, the best educated, the most liberally educated, with the best of education liberal arts can ever provide. There's irony there. I want you to think about it. When I talk about, because nobody is more of a believer in the power of the liberal arts to transform us as a society than I am. And yet I believe that my liberal education taught me we must tell the truth. We must learn from the truth. We must understand that simply going through classes and courses will not necessarily mean that we've reached where we need to go. They were products of their childhood experiences. They were not being non-caring. They thought that veterans were regular people, mainly white guys, by the way, not a lot of women, a few, not a lot of minorities, a few blacks, but they just thought regular guys should become tradespeople. Now, that was the thinking in the 60s. So, in the 40s, excuse me. And what happened was 2 million veterans went to college and did really well across disciplines. That discipline showed what they could do. They helped their families. And all of a sudden, America began to believe regular Americans, those who are not from great privilege, could get an education. And what did that mean? So in 65, people were ready to talk about others. So today, what percent have a college education? What do you think? A four-year institution education. What would you think? 35%? Anybody else? Come on, don't be risk-averse now. You've got to be able to take a chance. 40? Anybody else? 51%. Good. It's good. It's actually only 30%. Why do I ask you to guess? Why am I doing that? Yes. I like that, but it really isn't the reason. Well, maybe it's part of the reason, just that we don't know. You're right. I guess you're right. But why else am I? Why am I asking you to guess rather than simply putting up a chart and showing it to you? To make you actively listen. I mean, if we are so accustomed to watching a movie or whatever, to being passive in the work, that we just take things for granted. Now that you've thought about it and realized you either knew or you didn't know, you certainly won't forget that only 30% of Americans, and when you break it down by race, we now have all the groups. We can say 37% of whites. We can say that the fastest growing group in our country, Latina, the Latinx population, we're talking about only 15%. Having graduated from a four-year institution. Native Americans are below that, quite frankly. That blacks are up to about 22, 23%. You put it all together. And the Asian population, the highest achieving in our country, undeniably the highest achieving in our country, that group is at 55%. And the reason they are at that higher level is that many of them come here to graduate school and their children are here. So my campus is about 30% Asian. How many of you believe that there are many more high-achieving Indian and Chinese children than American children? In the U.S. Actually in the world first, but it's actually true in the U.S. too. It really is, disproportionately. When I ask the question, it's a great question to ask, by the way. When I ask the question, academics tend to cringe because it sounds politically incorrect. It is not politically incorrect. It is a mathematical question. It is not a politically incorrect. If it were a politically incorrect question, I would not have my job now because presidents cannot say things that are too controversial. Here's the point. There are 1.3 billion Chinese in the world. 1.2 billion Indians in the world. You put those two together, you have 2.5 billion people. What is 10% of 2.5 billion? Don't you let me leave here saying you don't know arithmetic. What's 10% of 2.5 billion? 250 million. How many Americans are there in total? 310, 320, something like that, right? So those two countries have as many high achievers as we have citizens in the world. But if you come to this country and you look at the most prestigious of institutions, those with the highest SATs, whatever, you will find disproportionately large numbers from those populations. And there is your reason. The base is so large. You get my point? Now, you add to that something about the immigrant population that often there is this intensity, this hunger. If you look throughout the 20th century, the Nobel laureates in the humanities or the sciences often grew up in New York. They went to the poor man's college, City College, or Brooklyn College, and they went on and got the Nobel Prize, coming out of houses where parents didn't necessarily speak English well, coming from European families. Why? How? Hunger, intensity. Think about it. And so the fact is, whether talking about those who've been wonderful in the arts and humanities or talking about the science areas and those, If it were not for people over the last 50 to 100 years who've come from other countries, we would not be with the position of being absolutely the best in the world in those areas. If you come to my part of the country, to the Baltimore-Washington corridor, which is the largest concentration of PhDs in many of the science and engineering areas, you will see that disproportionately large numbers are those at the top. You got an undergrad degree in another country, came here to grad school because we're considered the best. It is just a fact. And so what I want you to think about today is, what is it we're trying to achieve as we talk about the value of the liberal arts, as we talk about the liberal arts and sciences, as we understand, first of all, as I'm always saying, that we're talking about, yes, the humanities and the social sciences, but we're also talking about math and science. I'm always teasing my friends in the humanities to say, don't you dare think that the liberal arts are only in your disciplines. Anybody who knows the background, the quadrivium and the trivium, would know, of course. I'm studying French right now. When I told my students, my wife and I decided to study French, we can read some German from college, but we decided to study French as fun and to read French philosophers. And my first thing my students said was, don't you think you're kind of old, right? Which really was all I needed, right? Bring it on. So we're studying French, and what I will tell you that's very interesting is that as I look at French philosophers who are also mathematicians, as you think about it, and some of you here speak French. So Jacqueline m'a fait mémoire, nous avons passé du temps par Paris en août dernier pour notre anniversaire. Plusieurs étudiants à UMBC parlent français couramment, so mes étudiants et moi, nous parlons le français chaque jour. J'étudie le plus qu'à parfait, the long parfait, and what my students learn is, you never stop learning. And there's my point, that when you think about whether it is in the sciences or in the humanities or in languages, that there is this opportunity for all of us to show our students that you never stop learning. It was Hrabowski, the Nobel laureate, who grew up in New York, who said that when he was a kid in school, he'd come home and he said all of his friends' mothers would say, "Did you ask a good question today?" No. He said, others would say, "Did you learn anything today?" His mother would say, "Did you ask a good question today?" And he said the encouraging of his curiosity made him the thinker he became. It seems to me that one of our challenges is to create an environment on our campuses that encourages good questions, and questions we've not thought about. When one of the professors from literature said, talk about intersectionality, I keep thinking about that. The fact is that my colleagues across disciplines have been saying some of the things you've been saying at this conference. Given where we are in Baltimore, even though we're on 600 acres in the suburbs, we cannot separate ourselves from Baltimore City. And when Freddie Gray came, it was an amazing opportunity to focus on what we'd already been doing with children in the city, to look at what we do in the arts with the police force and kids, inner city kids, to what we're doing in science, but also to think about how we rethink the curriculum in interesting ways. And so our approach to continuing to learn is to suggest that in the name of not being passive learners, that we offer faculty the opportunity to rethink courses, not only the typical courses, but across disciplines, to look at ways in which we can use technology, to think about how we bring the community's challenges into the work. Because what the faculty on my campus finally said was how lacking in gravitas we would be if we continue to be the same when we see the fire and the challenges and the children being killed 15 miles away. And one of the questions I would ask of us in the liberal arts, as I've talked around the country, is, yes, the liberal arts can help us to open our minds and our hearts, can teach us to think, can do what Fred Lawrence from Phi Beta Kappa says, to teach us to present arguments with evidence, to be able to listen carefully to other points of view, to be able to engage in reasoned debate, to be able to find the common ground. But even as we do all of that, what I want you to think about is, with all that we've done over the years in the liberal arts, what are we missing? What else is it we need to do? Somebody said, give us a charge about what we should be doing. What my campus is doing right now, and what I would challenge you to do, is to ask this question. When students come to you, are you convinced that by the time they graduate, they have examined self? They've examined their values. They've learned to talk with people different from themselves. They've questioned some of the assumptions they've made about other people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, and that they have the humility to know they can always keep learning. The challenge we face is that too often people go through the motions and they have some skills. Yes, they can read and they can write, but are we changing the heads and hearts of our students? Some, yes. I told college presidents, I was working with new college presidents in the Harvard program last week, and I said we all are valuing the liberal arts, and we've sent many students through our programs into law school and other places, and we are the first to criticize Congress, and guess what? Congress, for the most part, they're all graduates of our institutions. And many had liberal arts majors. The question is, what happened? I would argue, again, that we must be so strong in talking about the liberal arts that we're able to help people question everything they've learned all their lives. When you think about it, the fact is it's so easy to continue to say and do what your parents told you to say and do because we look up to our parents. And yet, as I tell my students, my parents and your parents, they're all human. Nobody's perfect. There's always a better way of thinking about it. Wow, that's interesting. It was about questions. The Siri came on its own. Excuse me. And I am kind of shocked. Wait a minute. Got me. I've forgotten what I was saying. Wait a minute. I think I was saying something about my parents were not perfect. Since they're in heaven, maybe they were telling me something right there to shut up. But this is what I want. This is what I really want you to think about. We have these two challenges. We know this. One is to promote the liberal arts and to make it clear why they are important. I gave the ACE keynote, one of them this year, and everybody's saying, well, does higher education matter? What is my answer? Absolutely. We must be the first ones to say with joy, absolutely, because while we may hear people saying in some party that people don't believe in college education, how many families do you know who've become educated who are saying they don't want their kids to go to college? Once you've been touched by that experience, you know what it means to have that education. We have the challenge, we have several challenges. One is to talk about why the liberal arts are still so important, why it is important to think about what they've done over the years. You know, when I think about that civil rights period and all of the grounding in the humanities and social sciences, and King and others with philosophy. I'll go back 10 years to the 1954 decision. And people talk about the law and Thurgood Marshall, but they don't talk about the social scientists. I just read a paper given by, again, by Fred Lawrence, talking about the fact that we're about to have the 65th anniversary of that 1954 decision, that what really made the difference was the grounding in the social sciences, was the psychology of those children who chose blonde-haired black children who would choose a baby with blonde hair over a child who looked like herself, and the emphasis of that. And so I would argue that the liberal arts are for us, with us, and will always be us, not simply because of what they've done in the past, but because it will be only through the liberal arts that we will change society in the ways that we know it should be changed. We know that we are in this period of inequity, and that too many people are comfortable with the haves and have-nots. We know that an educated family has a much higher chance of kids going to college and graduating, and those in the bottom quarter of any race right now have maybe 20%. We know that, quite frankly, while we were, how many of you in this room, for example, are between the ages of 35 and 70? Let me see your hands. So I've got good news and bad. Which one you want first? Bad news is you're getting a little old, all right? Just like me, all right? It's just real, all right? But it beats the alternative. We know that, right? But the good news is if you're an American, you are best educated in the world. Literally, number 2 in the world. How many of you are between 25 and 34? They're so proud. Look at them. They say, yeah, I'm the youngest. She said, yeah, right? I got good news and bad. Which one you want first? Bad news is you're not as smart as we are. I'm sorry. Kidding. No, I'm kidding. Kinda kidding. But the bad news is, kinda kidding. The bad news, the real fact is this, that while this older group, all of us over going towards 40 to the 60s, are number 2, your group is number 12. Number 12. Americans who are between 25 and 34 are number 12 because people go to college, they never graduate. And so if you look at some of the data that we've worked on in the articles on my own campus, it has been on how to use analytics across the board. How do you look to determine with specificity how students are doing by race, by gender, by income level, by major, by aspiration, all right? How do you look at intervention strategies that focus not only on the idea of a deficiency in a student, but on ways in which we as colleagues can be better? How do we give faculty opportunities to rethink the way they teach? I mean, the most exciting course to me this past year involved a history teacher, professor, and a computer science professor who brought the classes together to focus on the Pratt Street, the 1861 war, Civil War on Pratt Street, which happened right around where Freddie Gray occurred. So they took the history from the 1860s period and looked at the challenges of inequality and race today. And the computing people taught the historians, the majors, some coding. The coders were taught a lot of history, and they developed a game focused on inequality and race and violence. And so it brought the work to life. And there's the point I want to make, that we must find ways, whether it's in a technical area or in the humanities. Look at our Breaking Ground series. We have given major grants to faculty to rethink their teaching that will connect what happens outside of the classroom in communities with children, whether talking about issues of poverty or academic achievement gap or health disparities, and bringing to the students the idea that it's through the lens of the liberal arts that we literally can appreciate and attack the challenges of our society. And so I strongly challenge you to remember that we must tell the truth. That even with a broad liberal education, even being rooted in the liberal arts, people can sometimes have the same biases they've always had. So we should not expect or say simply, the liberal arts is so wonderful, once you've gone through that, you're okay. I would say for myself and for each of us that a part of being truly educated is realizing we can always be better. We can always open our eyes more widely and think through what we have to do. We are in a period, if you haven't read the new report on the future of undergrad education, I was on that commission from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, read it, because it talks about the need to become more inclusive in the curriculum, in the faculty, in the administration, but it also talks about ways of connecting to students who are different from ourselves. And one of the approaches that has made all the difference on my campus is not only using analytics and the quantitative, but really taking the time to know our students and to hear their voices as they tell us how they perceive our environment to be. I would argue that none of our campuses can be seen to be quite as good as we think we are. That there's always room. On my campus, everybody knows, if you've not looked at our Mile program, look at the 60 Minutes piece. When I went to UMBC 25 years ago, we were seen as the most racist campus in my state. Why? Because a lot of black kids were flunking out in science. But when I looked at the data, turns out a lot of white kids were too. And we had to rethink the whole process and think about teaching and learning and think about supporting children in K through 12, many more things. Today, my campus has now produced more African Americans who've gone on to earn MD PhDs than any university in the history of America. Give my colleagues a round of applause. And the success that we had in science led to more in the humanities and social sciences and the idea of diversifying. And so I'm going to leave you with one story because I want time for questions. I'm going to leave you with a story about my grandmother who was 6th grade educated. And Mary and I had a wonderful conversation at the beginning about her family and just going from her background without the education to Williams, an amazing story. Each of you has a story. How many of you in this room are either first generation, first in your family, or first generation go to college? Raise your hands. It's an amazing, how many of you are second generation or second, right? You put those two together, that's most Americans. I'm saying tell your story. If you want to know what to do, tell your story, because students need to know you were not always at this level. They need to understand that we have our imperfections. And so here is the last story. My grandmother was trying to become a voting citizen, and that is especially so significant right now in Wetumpka, Alabama. And unfortunately, there was something called the Alabama Literacy Test. And so she went the first time, it was based on the Constitution, she failed, and she tried to study. The second time, literally, what she did was to tell several women, you take this part of the test, memorize the questions. They put the questions together. My mama, the English teacher, worked with her and others, and they started studying the Constitution, and they ended up studying history and understanding the background. And if you had heard my grandmother, you'd have thought she was a philosopher. or a lawyer. And she went the third time, and when she came into my house, she said, I am a voting citizen of America. She was 70 years old. Give my grandmama a round of applause. She was 70 years old. And then she said, I tell my students this, people have died so that women, people of color, and poor people could have the right to vote. How dare somebody not vote? Give me a round of applause for the idea of how dare people not vote. I don't tell you who to vote for. And I'm saying if we are about the liberal arts and about bringing empowerment, as Brandeis said, to citizenship, we must speak with passion about the connection. I challenge you to watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your actions. Watch your actions, they become your habits. Watch your habits, they become your character. I tell my students your character has everything to do with who you are when you don't think anybody can see you. What will you do? So thoughts become words. Words become actions. Actions become habits. Habits become character. Watch your character. It becomes your destiny. Dreams and values. We believe in the liberal arts? Absolutely. Thank you all very much. So let's take questions. Questions. Challenge me.
Freeman, thank you. David Scobie from Bringing Theory to Practice. This is really a question that responds to what you said about the Congress, people who went through our institutions, but it's also a reflection of the whole 2 days of this meeting, which has been fabulous. We have had a lot of eloquent defenses and arguments for the liberal arts, not only from academics and academic leaders, but from business people and pollsters and others. And they haven't just been feel-good defenses, they've been thoughtful. But I'm still left with trying to make sense of the disconnect between all of that good thinking and evidence about the power of liberal education and the fact that we're in a kind of public landscape where the most instrumental visions of education are winning the day, at least momentarily. And we've talked a lot about reframing the message. I think we've had good messages here. I don't feel like we've talked about what our communication strategy ought to be, for lack of a better word. To whom and how do we change it so that all of those Congress people and state legislators and opinion writers and ordinary citizens who went through this experience but are consenting to or colluding with this very instrumental and flat vision of higher education, how do we change minds?
So first of all, I have several things. Thank you for the question. First of all, I think we have to be very honest with ourselves that when we think about the academy and we think about the rest of the world, we have to ask the question, how do people view us? Now, I think the media goes overboard. I mean, our campuses are bursting with students. They really are. People who've been to college want their kids to have it. They just do. So when they said this party, no, take the educated people in that party. Show me their kids who are not going to college, all right? So I mean, that's just not true. It isn't. But we do know, you heard me say, only 1/3 of Americans have a college degree. So we're talking about 60+%, maybe almost 70%, who have not had the experience of having a person in their family graduate from college, and therefore not seeing the benefits and so they're not necessarily convinced. And what makes it worse is that many of those people from lower income backgrounds of all races started college, had miserable experiences, and are in more debt than ever. So of course they are thinking that way. So I have several thoughts. One is, how do we make sure that we, first of all, attract students from all kinds of backgrounds, and then make sure we give them the support they need? How do we take some responsibility in our communities for helping K through 12 so more children can read well and come to college and do well? If a student has to start in developmental mathematics, that student has about a 10% chance of graduating from college. So we're deluding ourselves, okay, about just how important pre-K through 12 must be if the student is to succeed. Next, I would say this, and this is the argument, the fabulous conversations we've been having on my campus. I had arguments with some of my young colleagues because they were so bothered by the election that they were presenting a point of view in such a way that people who had another point of view were uncomfortable talking about what they really thought. And this is when I get bothered by political correctness. Because if I cannot allow a student to say whatever he or she thinks and to put it on the table, the unexamined life, right? Then I'm not beginning to have an opportunity for us to talk about where the common ground is, maybe how we can change that point of view. And so we've had to have some interesting conversations, great conversations. The Academy should be a place. What we say on my campus is we want to take pride in agreeing to disagree agreeably. Did you get that? With civility. The problem in our country is when once people start disagreeing, it becomes very emotional, and people aren't listening to each other. They're trying to win the argument. And this is where I say we have a failure in our education. The liberal arts. I think if we're going to really practice what the liberal arts will mean about asking the hard questions, we have to say, where have we not been as effective? It's not enough just to say it's wonderful. Now, I would be the first to fight and say I want anybody to have that opportunity for liberal arts because I know how it transforms lives, okay? And we can show all the examples, but I do think we have to ask our campuses ourselves, are we getting to connecting with helping students who are different, who may think differently from most of us, from many of us, to at least examine, while we examine the way we go about it. I mean, I will tell you that my campus, while being as international as it is in many ways, in a lot of ways, the microcosm of the country. There are at least 30, 40% who are from very homogenous backgrounds, who are told things like, don't get to know any blacks because they will corrupt you. Kids will come to me and say that is my dad bad? He's told me not to talk to black people, and learning how to talk to people. But I've also had African Americans from inner cities say, my parents told me not to get too close to white people. They'll pull you from us. So there are all these issues of race, of people who can be very intolerant, of people who are LGBTQ. I mean, all kinds of issues, right? And the question is, how do the communication strategy, I'm not even dealing with the communication strategy for Congress, because they are who they are, okay? I am dealing with and thinking about the communication strategy for getting people to vote and to understand public policy and to understand who is voting and helping poor people, right? This is where colleges can make a difference. But I think we have this challenge to question ourselves. Are we being as supportive of students who think differently from ourselves? Can we learn some things from them? I'll tell you one of the things I've learned. Some of the guys were very, very adamant about being supportive of the current president, and I said, let's talk about it. And one of the interesting things was that several said, well, we kind of thought, my dad kind of liked the last president, except he said he was going to help us, and he didn't do a thing for my family. Because we tend to think that public policy has changed in 2 or 3 years. You get my point? That it takes years sometimes for families to see whatever. And so some people are just saying we want to stir things up so we can be better off. And those of us who are comfortable, who have degrees and all of that, we don't appreciate what those who are disfranchised feel, of any race. You get my point? And so I'm saying a part of what we should be doing through the liberal arts should be having opportunities to hear those different perspectives, getting into communities to understand poverty and those challenges, but at the same time, helping our students think through what they might do in changing our societies, move towards widening inequality in so many ways. And a part of what I've learned is to be willing to listen intently, very intently, to that person who is disagreeing with me. We don't teach our students to do that effective. We've got to teach them to listen to that other point of view and to look for that common ground. It sounds so simplistic, but it's really hard. That would be my answer, okay? Thank you. Somebody else, please, question. Come on, I know you're tired, but come on, give me a question, Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the disparity between marginalized faculty and students that you teach more?
It's very good. One of our challenges there's nothing more difficult to talk about in America than race. Let's start there. And then depending on the culture, it can be LGBTQ, it can be all kinds, but let's just start there. And so people are somewhat uncomfortable when I say almost 80% of faculty are still white in America, okay? That is not a disparaging comment about whites. It is to say we have not pulled people in to the faculties. That my campus that is supposed to be a model of inclusive excellence, we finally have the first black in many of the departments. Rare to have 2, right? We have a program called STRIDE, STRIDE, that is designed to increase the diversity of blacks, Hispanics, and others. And what I will tell you is what made the difference in honest dialogue was it was really important to get some of my very powerful white guys to lead the effort. Because the power in science, for example, is in the hands of white men. If you go to the National Academy of Sciences, it is primarily white men. That's just fact, okay? And I've got some wonderful guys that I asked, I said, come on, guys, step up to the plate with me. Help me here, right? It's just important. Because, I mean, the difference with women, I mean, if you've not known the advanced program, for example, because women have been marginalized in many departments. The advanced program was started at MIT because when they did an analysis of the treatment of women faculty there compared to men, they found the women's salaries lower, that they had not negotiated for the same level of a package, that they had less space, that they were promoted at other levels. So the women who are by far the most esteemed in the world in science and engineering were being discriminated against. So much so that NSF put out this major RFP for the advanced program to increase the number of women in those disciplines, and most important, to get them becoming leaders. And we had one of those grants. And what I will tell you is that just starting with women in certain disciplines, you learn so much. We've learned so much about ways in which women are marginalized in certain departments. You start there. Gender, okay? And then when you have the one person in a department who loses of color or whatever, without people understanding what that person goes through, it is a true challenge. I remember when I was in grad school at the University of Illinois, there were 100 faculty in mathematics, and of course there was nobody black or Hispanic, but there was only one woman out of 100. And she was not a tenure track. She's PhD, she was wonderful. But she had a way of looking at me, and the look said, I understand, all right? And there was that connecting. When you've been the only one, you understand it. But we have to learn how to talk about these things without seeming like we're pointing fingers at anybody. It's not anybody's. It is a structural issue that we face. But what must happen, and I think the liberal arts can be helpful, is when we can have honest conversation, when people can say what they really think. When women were able to say on my campus, you know, if I say something, the guys just look. And then a guy comes right behind me and says the same thing, and they go, isn't that wonderful? And all the women go, yeah, I've had that experience, right? Or I'm talking and the guy just cuts me off, right? You know, so being able to have those honest conversations, it seems to me. And it seems to me that I would hope that the liberal arts, that studying the liberal arts will help us all to be more humble. And I'm going to just put it out there, okay? That too often experts are arrogant. Just real. This is what I hear from students, but this is what I know. I'm teasing. Sometimes I tease my colleagues. Have you ever noticed, and this is a group, you are the most privileged in the world in many ways. Have you ever noticed if you talk to a group of elementary school children, they're like, me, right? And the teachers are the same way, me, excited, right? You get to high school, they get a little more cynical, right? By the time you get to the academy, and I've been in it 40-some years, okay, there's a look we have. You all know that look. It's a look of a little doubt, right? At every level, it comes like that. And I would say, and it's not that everybody's not humble, but I would tell you, I do think that if you're going to talk about what we need to do with the liberal arts, we need to make sure that as people become more high achieving, that there's a level of humility that goes with it. I say this, we're at a public university, but we talk about religion on my campus a lot. My faith does help me it certainly does help me to keep that humility, but by the grace of God. I say that wherever I go. I said, I'm not proselytizing. This is what has helped me. My book even has religion in there. And as it talked about how it helps people to know what faith means. And so I even talk about the fact that it's been a part of what has helped me to produce scientists. Because most of the kids who've come through have had some support from their churches. Just fact. So I'm suggesting that we think a little out of the box. We tend to be so terribly analytical when talking about the liberal arts and sciences, and that we don't take the time to think about those habits of mind that might lead to a bit more humility. That would be, after 40 years in the academy, I can say that comfortably. I tell presidents that. There's a new book. Some people don't like reading the business books, but it's by Harvard Business Review. And I tell my colleagues, let's not be so closed-minded as not to look at what people say from other sectors. Okay? Doesn't mean we have to agree with all of it. Look at it anyway. And it says the mind of the leader. Look at it. The three themes: mindfulness, selflessness, and compassion. Think about it. Mindfulness, selflessness, and compassion. Who wouldn't want people to have those as we talk about ethical leaders? It's very important. One last question. Come on. Yes. One of the young people. Give a round of applause for being young. I love it.
Sorry. We all started young. Don't look at me like that. I just happen to still be it, right? So I work in admission, and I'm a social worker and a community organizer by background, and a peace studies major from here, right? And one thing we come up across, I think, in all of higher ed is this duality of real world versus bubble. And especially as populations into college education change, right, at all levels, and we think about this as a role for citizenship.
Yes.
Your thought about microcosm, or your word microcosm, really resonated. How do we message that and live it so that our time together, lived work for us as professionals, and the time that students spend here, they see that as a microcosm of their wider community as a citizen, and not a bubble that's artificial and elitist and all the other adjectives we could do. How do we do that better?
I think the most enlightened institutions understand that in many ways faculty and students and staff need to be involved in the larger problems in society, whether it's in our own communities or what we do internationally. The grand challenges in engineering has become more liberal arts oriented. If you look at go and look at what they talk about in the National Academy of Engineering, and the grand challenges have to do with helping poor people in many ways. So I have students who spend summers in rural Kenya developing clean water structures, but they're interdisciplinary teams, intersectionality, from psychology, from social work, from engineering, from statistics, all these areas, working with that community, that village, right? Teaching reading at the same time, building a structure, because these children are drinking water that's infested with feces. Now, they will never be the same because we take little things like that for granted, right? And so what I'm saying is that whether it is my students who are working in India in disruptive technologies in hospitals with interdisciplinary teams, or it is about going into Baltimore City and seeing children who can't read, it's the same thing, that we realize we are connected to those less fortunate than we are. I think those of you from these liberal arts institutions have a special mission, typically, that focuses on of those too much is given, much is required. The question is, how do we live that out? That is the point. I will ask you a question. The average American now lives to be twice as long as he did 100 years ago. In 1900, what do you think the average lifespan was? 47. How many of you are over 47? So just imagine, you might not be here today if it was 1900, right? Today, the average lifespan, women a little more than men, but 80, something like that. What is the number one reason? What is the number one reason? What'd you say? That's a part of it, less infant mortality, but there's one special reason, and I'm going to tell you why I say it. And that's a part of it, but it's something even more fundamental. Clean water. Now, let me tell you why I tell you this. The National Academy of Engineering said, they say what we say in the liberal arts, believe it or not. The National Academy of Engineering says engineers don't know how to sell themselves. So nobody knows that you all are alive because of engineers. The sewage system. And I give it to you because it's a great example of their determining, well, wait a minute. People wouldn't be living if it were not for clean water, if it were not for the sewage system, if it were not for engineering. So they're teaching people to say just that so they can know, because we think antibiotics, we think about the medical profession, we don't think about engineers. They will admit they are not good at selling themselves, right? They're good at solving a math problem. And so the challenge, and so they're working to get them to learn how to present and to talk about what they do with society. I would argue the same thing. We should be able to say, as we close, we should be able to say why and for what purpose the liberal arts. I would say it is to dream about the possibilities and to learn to connect with each other. I want you to stand because I got something for you to do. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Get up before they come up. Stand up very quickly. Repeat after me.
Sure you get a chance.
Repeat after me.
I'm sorry.
Thoughts, words, actions, habits, character, destiny. Now this time be mindful, because after this time I'm giving you a test on it. You got it? Thoughts, words, actions, habits, character, destiny. Okay, here's your test. Watch your thoughts, they become your... one more time so you know what it is now. You know what the test is. Thoughts. Then let's go together. Thoughts, words, actions, habits, character, destiny. Okay, here we go. Watch your thoughts, they become your... Watch your words, they become your... Watch your actions, they become your... Watch your habits, they become your... Watch your character, becomes your... Thank you all. Passion makes a difference. Thank you. Hi. Okay. Thank you, St. Kate's. I'll sit with you. Let me get my water. I'm coming right back.
If I could just have 5 more minutes, maybe 11. We'll see. First, another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all. With great joy.
Michael's going to offer some closing comments, and I will wrap us up.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming to Central Minnesota in the middle of your summer. You all other things you could be doing, allowing us to understand the opportunity cost of your time. So we recognize that you took a big chunk of time out of a busy time of the year for you. Maybe not so busy, a time you could have been relaxing as well, though, at least. I hope you leave this conference feeling optimistic about the future. We've talked a lot about the challenges higher education faces. There's no question that they are real. We don't have answers to many of those challenges, but 2 things make me incredibly optimistic about the future. One is very practical. The reality is, whatever the criticisms of higher education are, whatever the press is saying, whatever the concerns are about liberal arts, et cetera, education is only going to become more important for future generations. There's no question about that. I don't think anyone in this room would disagree with that. So we are going to continue to be an incredibly important sector for our country and for the world. So as a practical matter, we're still going to be around in 20, 30, 50, 100 years. We don't exactly know how we're going to be around and what shape that will take, but we're going to be here. And that should make us all very optimistic. The second point is a more hopeful one by looking at those in this room. As you all know, there are 2,300 four-year undergraduate institutions, four-year degree granting institutions in this country. We've heard from lots of them from the R1 places like Maryland, Baltimore County, from Georgetown. We've heard thoughts about places like Stanford. But there are also a lot of places like our institutions, small liberal arts institutions around the country. And the beauty of our model is it's so diverse, we can meet the needs of virtually any population you throw at us. There is a right place for every kid that wants, or every adult that wants an education in the future. And we are part of that. And the fact that there are thousands, millions of you thinking about these issues all around the country make me very hopeful for the future. So thank you for being part of that hope for me. Thanks for coming.
So thank you, Michael. And I just want to add my most heartfelt thank you for joining us for Liberal Arts Illuminated. I will confess that the past few days far exceeded my grandest hopes and aspirations for this conference. And that's primarily due to the collegiality, the insight, and the wisdom of our speakers, our conference planners, and actually each and every one of you who's here who chose to be fully present with us over the past few days to illuminate the liberal arts in pursuit of inclusive excellence. I am delighted with the resonance between the speakers, and even more so with the ways that you stepped out of your comfort zone to engage with the speakers, to put plans together, to provide for a brighter future for all of our students. I again just want to very briefly thank all of the supporters and sponsors of Liberal Arts Illuminated, and I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this conference would not have been possible without the major support of U.S. Bank. U.S. Bank and my board chair, Terry Dolan, were once again the catalyst for this conference by being the official sponsor, and I am truly grateful for Terry's generous leadership and support. Having that support from U.S. Bank made our time together possible. A tremendous thank you to the planning committee, each of whom worked diligently on the strategy and the logistics of the conference, who helped secure the wonderful speakers we had, and again, who spread the word about the conference so that each one of you could be in this room so that we could learn together. I'm, of course, grateful to our St. Ben's catering and facilities staff, to the students, alums, and volunteers who brought us all together and made our Benedict and hospitality visible, and I hope welcoming to each of you. And last but most assuredly not least, in my thank you portion of my wrap-up, there's a quartet of people that I need to thank. You heard of a few of them this morning. So Tammy Moore and Margaret Arnold and Catherine Ank and Jordan Narlock worked for months on this conference. So if the four of you could stand. They thank you all. They made this feel seamless. There were lots of people working on this. There's Val and Caitlin and IA and student development, but they worked for months on this to make it feel seamless, and I am truly grateful to each of you. We have had lots of summarizing opportunities, so I'm not going to do much of that right now, but I do want to share just a final, maybe it's a summative perspective. Last night, as I was listening to Adam Weinberg speak and looking at the conference logo on the stage behind him, it struck me that the word that became most important to me during this conference was leadership. Now, this was a surprising realization for me in some ways because liberal arts and inclusive excellence were the words that I was most compelled by in conceiving and putting together and planning the conference. But as I've listened to our speakers, from Lynn Pascarella to Freeman Hrabowski, I've come to realize that there's not a secret to a class or a text in the curriculum that's going to make the difference. I realize it's not about a single stated outcome or even a single gap in our outcomes data. It's not about resolving the economic model in a particular way or ways. What kept coming up for me again over the past few days is that it really is about being willing to lead from whatever your position or role or location on your campus, being willing to lead in a way that places you in relationship with the students we have the privilege of educating. It's about leading in such a way that you're willing to see students whom others may choose to render as invisible. It's about looking at your syllabus and with clear eyes asking, can each student in my course see themselves in this syllabus? It's about a campus community committing to mentoring every person on campus as an institutional commitment as opposed to simply a program. It's about having the humility to put together a whole brain team, as we heard this morning. It's leadership to not ask our students to sacrifice curiosity for meritocracy, again, referring back to this morning. And it's leadership to write our own narrative about the liberal arts and inclusive excellence. Reframing the narrative is about leadership, and again, that's all of us fearlessly facing discrepant outcomes. It's about recognizing that the data can be painful to examine. It's knowing that exclusion is real and alive on our campuses, but it's also knowing that it's an intentional and necessary experience of that pain in order to move our community to a better place. It's not about being paralyzed or afraid by data. It's about choosing to see the humanity that's behind the data. It's not about a budgeting spreadsheet because spreadsheets are easy, John McGee said. It's about making choices that reflect who we are and what we are committed to. It's about investing in the difficult soul work of the liberal arts and inclusion. So as I think about what we have to do next at St. Ben's, I think about how do we invest more in the development of the whole community. And that feels heretical because, as you know, in resource-constrained institutions, we invest in students first. But how do we make sure that our investment in students comes from a community that is mentored and supported and cared for? And I know all of us carry that challenge back with us. So all of that came to me last night, and I just need 2 more minutes of your time. But I sprang up this morning, and I realized that for me, the leadership that made a difference in my experience as a student was a faculty member. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that the liberal arts saved my life. There's not a single doubt in my mind that if I had not had exposure to the liberal arts, there's no way that I would be here today. For me, it was this faculty member who saw beyond my accent and my poverty and my complete lack of social capital and my insecurity that made a difference for me. She saw me, and gently she said, "You can do this." And that made the transformative difference in my life. She wasn't a president. She wasn't even a department chair. And I don't know if Lori's ever been to a diversity training, What I know is that she was willing to see my humanity and to say the great values of the liberal arts tradition can change my life. She said, if you'll allow me to journey with you, we can do this. And she let me know that there was a world bigger than rural North Carolina and tobacco farms and dirt farms that I had known to that point. She equipped me to believe that if I could learn how to think and to apply that thinking, that I could do anything. She told me that I could be free of all the constraints the world might want to place upon me if I chose to learn to think. And while I do remember a lot of what she taught in her classes, what changed my life was her believing in me. So as we depart today, our work is to lead so that every student on our campus has a champion who believes in them and the transformative power of the liberal arts. We have to leave today and go back and create structures that enable us to marry those beliefs and to ensure transformation happens for every one of our students. So what I hope now most of all that you'll take away from these few days is the desire to see the humanity of the students you served. Tyon asked yesterday, how do you help students that others want to be invisible or don't believe exist? And I pray that you leave today as leaders embracing those students and what the liberal arts can do to change their lives. I beg you to leave and to lead with hope and with purpose and with joy as we all do this life-changing work. And most of all, I need you to leave and to do something that makes our work more sustainable, something that speaks back to the narrative that is crushing the liberal arts, something that helps you and others propel a student's success, a student who may not even be able to see it for themselves, a student whom the world may want to render invisible. So I think that perhaps Bill Cronin described our collective mission and work together best when he wrote nearly 20 years ago in an article titled Connections, the following: more than anything else, being an educated person means being able to see the connections that allow one to make sense of the world and act within it in creative ways. A liberal arts education is about gaining the power and the wisdom, the generosity, and the freedom to connect. A liberal education is not something we ever achieve. It's not a state. Rather, it's a way of living in the face of our own ignorance, a way of groping toward wisdom in full recognition of our own folly, a way of educating ourselves without any illusion that our educations will ever be complete. Education for human freedom is also education for human community. The two cannot exist without each other. Liberal education nurtures human freedom in the service of human community, which is to say, Cronin concludes, that in the end, it celebrates love. As we commit to doing the work, let us also commit to human freedom, human community, and love. Thank you for being here, and safe travels home.